y'all for being here with me tonight. I really appreciate it. The warm St. Louis welcome there. I really appreciate that. I want to talk about a bunch of things tonight and then get into some conversation about whatever you guys want to get into, or almost whatever you guys want to get into. We're able to talk about 99% of the subjects in the world, but respectfully avoid one thing that we in this country have already argued about 1,000 times, and nothing new will be broken tonight. But, you know, one of the things when I started to think about what I wanted to talk to you guys about is what's going on in terms of politics and the re-election of Barack Obama and what that means for this country. Two things jump out at me about what it means. For one thing, this time we voted for a man with foibles, with flaws, who really could not be seen as a sort of Superman. The first time around, Obama sort of presented himself as this sort of Superman, right? And even McCain had to respond to it and say, like, well, look, he presents himself as this global celebrity, right? He's not this global celebrity. He's not a Superman. And he presented himself as, I'm brilliant, super capable, I can accomplish anything. The second time, after the first term, he's brought down to earth, right? He cannot part the seas anymore, right? He's not this sort of person who's just going to come in and change the tone in Washington, change the climate, change everything, right? He's no longer the sort of magical Negro, right? Everybody who becomes president or runs for president is a fairly extraordinary individual, but in the realm of extraordinary individuals, now suddenly he was sort of brought down to earth a little bit more. So the idea that we would support a more, quote-unquote, down-to-earth, regular-ish black person as opposed to a Superman is somewhat extraordinary, I think. I mean, I think when the country's in trouble, if an extraordinary person shows up, black, white, or green, you're going to be like, yo, we want him to save us because we're in trouble. He's extraordinary. A more regular person is like, wow, like, you know, I think we've seen this in our lives that if you are extraordinary as a black person, you can get ahead. My mom, before I was about to go to first grade, she said, you have to be twice as good as those white kids. We're not get to real equality till we don't have to be twice as good. And that was the Barack Obama of 2012. The man was like, I'm not twice as good, I'm just as good. So please give me another chance to keep doing what I've been doing. So that he could get reelected after a tough first term and showing himself to be human is somewhat extraordinary. The other thing that really stood out is the lack of power that white voters now have in America. The white percentage of the electorate has dropped steadily every election since 1980. And now, even when white voters come together in near historic numbers, I think the percentage for Romney was at around 60%, which is near historic numbers, even still they can't get to choose the candidate they want because black and brown and Asian people came together in massive clusters to reject Romney and the GOP and support what Obama was talking about. So you see the browning of America starting to happen there. Already more than 50% of the babies in America are black, brown, and Asian. That browning of America is here, and it's happening. We're already starting to see the impact of that on the electoral stage. People are talking about Texas turning purple from the consistent red that it's been for years and years because the rise of Hispanics in America. In 2042, there will be more black, brown, and Asian people than white people in America. And when you see those sort of demographic trends, you see that the GOP is no longer going to be able to function as long as so much of what they're about is being hostile to black and brown people, and gay people, and in some ways to women. This is part of why you see the GOP now coming around on immigration reform, because when they're talking about illegals and aliens and things like SB 1070 in Arizona, it's making them self-deport, which ultimately just ends up demonizing a lot of legal American citizens who happen to be Hispanic. How can you get behind supporting a party like that? You know, that is promoting policies that make you afraid for your grandmother to go out at night, or for your, you know, teenage cousin or son to go out at night because they might get caught by somebody who says, are you really American? Can you prove it? Asking them to prove that they are really American is to me reminiscent of the free paper check that a lot of black people went through in the years after slavery. How are you going to get people to support your party when you feel like they're treating you like you're not really American? Even when you're talking about the sort of birther movement, it's the GOP looking at black people and saying, you're not really American. They located around Barack Obama, but in saying you're not really American or prove that you're really American, even though you're already the president. So clearly you had to have shown your papers several times to get to be the president because you were already a senator. But now we want to see them yet again. And I think a lot of black people correctly read that as saying you as a black person are not really American. You're not a true American like we are as white people. We read that. We understand what the real message there is, and we are rightly offended by that. And when you have a party that's sending out those sort of messages, they're not going to be able to just turn the tide demographically, certainly not in one election cycle, maybe not in two. What the GOP has been selling for so many years, perhaps since 1964, is racial resentment and white racial anxiety. That's a key way that they drive working class white people into their party. It's sort of surprising to remember that, or to learn that before the 60s, a lot of black people, most black people were Republicans, right? Dr. King was not a Republican. He didn't choose the party, but his father was a lifelong Republican, because a lot of black people were Republicans at that point. But in 1964, everything changes, right? With LBJ supporting the Civil Rights Act and Barry Goldwater, the Republican, is not. And at that point, black people start to go with the Democratic Party, and you see that as the Democrats are extending rights to black people by the Civil Rights Act, and then to women by the ERA, and to gays, right, in recent years, gay rights movement. The liberals, the Democrats are extending rights to people, and the Republicans seem to be looking at it as a zero-sum game, that when we extend rights to other people, we lose rights. And so they're selling this sort of racial anxiety to people that we will not encroach on your rights. We will protect your rights as white people. This was very good for them in the 80s, right? When Reagan was talking about welfare queens and crack kingpins, and Bush is talking about Willie Horton and getting tough on crime. This whole Southern strategy of playing to white racial anxiety was working very well for them, but since 1992, it has not worked out for them, right? And they've lost 5 out of 6 popular votes, and the way things are going with this Republican Party that is far right, and you have the rise of Hispanics in America, unless they can figure it out with Hispanics, and just getting immigration reform alone will not be enough. It could be several more cycles outside of the White House, which could start to be truly devastating for them. This sort of demographic trend suggests more ahead. You can't stop serving white racial resentment, white racial anxiety, and serve black and brown voters. It's not going to work. You can only serve one at a time, and if they stop serving white racial anxiety, then they lose a central part of their constituency, a central part of their appeal to the white working class voters. So this is part of the internal war that the GOP is going through right now, and it's going to be a little bit hard to break because some of the true leaders of the party are the media thought leaders, Rush Limbaugh, Ann Coulter, Michael Savage, Bill O'Reilly, Sean Hannity. These people spend a lot of time spewing this sort of racism or sort of white racial anxiety that goes into the voters, and they demand it from the politicians, who can then sort of, cue it to them. Sort of, we talked about dog whistles a lot in the 2012 campaign, but we've had dog whistles going back for decades now. This was just the first time we actually codified it with that name. But when Glenn Beck talks about the president hates white America, or we talked about the birther movement before, the white racial anxiety is cued. People hear that. People respond to that. Romney had this ad during the campaign saying Obama wants to remove the work requirement from welfare. People remember that ad? right? This was the ad that he ran more than any other. And while he was saying that, you saw these images of hardworking blue-collar white people, right? So what is the message? That the black president wants to take away your hard-earned dollars, you blue-collar workers, you salt of the earth, and give them to lazy blacks who won't even have to work for it. And that sort of message resonates, and it's been part of the GOP's message for decades now. People understand that. You don't have to scream it. You can say it in this dog-whistly, subtle way, and people understand what you're talking about. Those sort of attitudes are consistently transmitted through the right-wing media into the voters. They want to hear their anger answered by their politicians and their candidates, and they respond to it. So that's part of why we have politicians, especially on the right, becoming more and more radicalized, going more and more right-wing, the Tea Party dragging the party further and further rightward, outside of the mainstream. Going to have them try to return from that just to get to a place of sort of moderation where they might be able to be acceptable to a lot more people. Otherwise, they're going to have a hard time in national elections. Some of you might say, well, what about Congress? Well, we have districts now that are gerrymandered, and people sort of choose to live among other people like them, so sort of self-gerrymandering. So it appears that the House of Representatives will remain in the structure that it's in for quite a long time. So we're sort of stuck in the system of a Senate that is close with a Democratic lead, and a House that has a fairly strong Republican lead majority, and then the White House is the tipping point, and quite consistently it's been a Democratic White House that's perhaps into the future. Turning the table a little bit, one thing I noticed also that the Obama presidency does not do, it does not change everyday life for black people. I think some thought maybe when he was elected it would make a difference, but it really doesn't. I think there is a profound sort of spiritual impact of the Obama presidency. I talked to a lot of people who sort of cried on the night that he was elected, feeling like, wow, I feel welcomed into America. I feel fully American for the first time in my life, because I think as black people, we feel tied to, proud of St. Louis or East St. Louis or Oakland or Atlanta, Harlem, Brooklyn, wherever you may live. But patriotism with America is much more fraught and complex, because America has hurt you in small and large and direct and indirect ways. So we have much more difficult time relating to America. The Obama election made that much easier. But is there a sort of direct day-to-day change in our lives? Do the Trayvon Martins still happen? Oscar Grants still happen? There's a little girl in Detroit whose name is escaping me, killed by the police. Those sort of things still happen. I'm not talking about the girl who got shot in Chicago last week. I'm talking about a 7-year-old girl who got shot by police a couple years ago. The impact of the spiritual awakening of the Obama election is going to take years to unpack, but the day-to-day change in American life for black people is not happening, and it's not going to happen anytime soon, because you can't change the structural problems of America with just one president. We still have substandard schools. We still have an unemployment rate that is double the white unemployment rate, and it has been for 4 or 5 decades. We still have a situation where, when studies show when a black person goes to apply for a job, their likelihood of getting hired is equal to that of a white person who has a felony conviction record, right? Obama can't just come and change that. We have median wealth in the black community that is a fraction of the median wealth in the white community. And this is to say nothing of what happens when we start talking about the war on drugs, right? And how black and white people use and sell drugs at nearly identical rates, but we are far more likely to be arrested. When we are arrested, we are far more likely to be prosecuted. Prosecutors have total discretion on who they choose to prosecute and who they do not. Right? And there's no oversight over that. Consistently, white kids from the suburbs or what have you, they get arrested for a bag of weed, and they're given a second chance. The black kid is not. And when we are prosecuted, we are more likely to be convicted, and when we are convicted, we are more likely to get longer sentences. So there's this way that the war on drugs sort of sucks us in and doesn't really let us go. And I mean, all these things are structurally in place, right? It's not always that everybody is sort of putting in racist things and saying we're going to screw the black people, but there's ways that these advantages of whiteness and the disadvantages of blackness accumulate over and over. And it's not just through our lives, right? This is going back generations that this happens. Some of the older people around here in this room will remember in the 50s, the Federal Housing Administration wanted to make it easier for Americans to own their homes. So they passed out thousands of loans for Americans to become homeowners. 98% of those loans went to white people. So what did that do? That made all these white people able to buy homes, and we know that intergenerational transfers of wealth are a huge marker or predictor of you being wealthy. If your parents own their own home, they are more likely to have money to be able to help you pay for school, get that first down payment, which is a really big hurdle for a lot of people, or start a business, or maybe all three, or two of those three. When your parents can help you get into wealth, then you have a far greater chance of that, right? If your parents own a home, you're more likely to end up owning a home. And very few people in the black community have that. And part of those advantages, and part of that goes back to, from the Federal Housing Administration, that they weren't giving us loans. And there's hundreds of examples like that. And, the white people might say, hey, I'm not racist. I didn't create that system. Well, that's absolutely right. The people who received those loans, they weren't racist, but they're dealing in a system of white privilege where they were able to benefit from being white, even without being racist. And they might say, well, hey, I worked hard for that. Well, I'm sure you did. I'm sure that you took the advantages of being white and you worked hard. No one's saying you didn't do that. But there's this consistent way that the advantages of whiteness accumulate over generation after generation, and the disadvantages of blackness accumulate. This doesn't mean that nobody can succeed. Of course, certain people are able to break through the system. We all talk about Oprah and Eric Holder and Valerie Jarrett and these sort of people, these individuals, right, who pop up in small ways and break through the system. Sure, that's going to happen, but the vast majority of us are not able to do that. There might be white people here right now saying, well, I'm not rich and my parents weren't rich, and then, well, not everybody's going to be able to access white supremacy or white privilege in the same way. I understand that, but that certainly doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. The advantages multiply for most people. I want to go back to the war on drugs for a moment, talk about that a little bit before we start talking about questions which you guys want to talk about. But, I had actually a really interesting conversation with brothers and sisters from the Black student group beforehand. And one of the things we did not talk about, we actually had a great conversation about Django, which I want to expand into this room. One of the things we didn't really get into is talking about hip-hop and its relationship to the war on drugs, which I find a really interesting lens on the black community and the ways that we deal with our own oppression, right? Because I've been talking a lot about how we are oppressed, but how do we deal with that oppression? And just one sort of example of that you can see through the lens of hip-hop. Because in the 80s, when the war on drugs began, and then after that, the crack epidemic began. Oh, wait a minute, how did that happen? The war on drugs preceded the crack epidemic? The war on drugs happened at a time when drug use in America was actually going down, and then the crack epidemic came after that? Well, that's weird. I wonder how that happened. But when those things were going on, when drugs and drug dealing were mentioned in hip-hop, it was almost always as a negative. right? If you look back on songs like Melly Mel and White Lines, or Public Enemy, Night of the Living Bassheads, or Run DMC, or KRS-One, when they talked about crack or drugs or drug dealers, there's always as a negative. There's always making them into villains, right? As we move into the very late 80s and the 90s, we start to see something different. People start in hip-hop to embrace the war on drugs, to say, I am from that. I was a drug dealer, right? Cool G Rap started that in the mid-80s, but he was sort of alone with that. As you move into the rise of the West Coast, and the rise of the South, and then the re-rise of New York in the early to mid-90s, you start to see more of that, right? I was a drug dealer. Biggie, Snoop, Wu-Tang, Jay-Z, a little later Lil Wayne, a little later Fat Joe, 50 Cent, Rick Ross. We can go on and on with people who are now, who've been powerful the last 20 years, saying, I came from that, right? And what are they doing? They're saying, I am the monster that you've been talking about, that you've been seeing in the streets. So you see these people who are saying, well, you know, if we're going to be oppressed, I might as well profit off of it, right? Which is sort of a really tragic sort of thing to say. It's sort of like this Pavlovian dog response of like, you know, we've just been getting shocked and shocked and shocked, and the dog after a while stops moving. At least in this case, they're getting rich, but I don't think that these individuals getting rich off of our communal pain is any sort of valuable or progressive step. Part of what happened is that there was a movement in terms of who was the prime consumer of the music. In the 80s, the prime consumer of the music was the black urban male, who was into Afrocentrism. So you had, you know, your Poor Righteous Teachers, you know, early De La Soul, other people like that, Tribe Called Quest, Queen Latifah, and people who I think were rightly skeptical of what these poisons in our community were doing. They live in the community, they see how crack is destroying the community. They're not fetishizing it. When you get into the 90s and the double O's, the previous generation, previous decade, the dominant consumer is the white suburban male, who's coming to hip-hop as more of a tourist, right? To take me inside the community. I want to see what it's like, right? Sort of like going to a horror movie to see what it's like. They are much more interested in the fetishization of the culture and of the community. So when there's, you know, so when people are coming and saying, hey, I'm a drug dealer, I'm really badass, that seems really cool. Now, of course, black people as consumers have not rejected this at all. I mean, the people that I named, people who I named, 50 Cent, Lil Wayne, Jay-Z, these are some of our most favorite rappers. But certainly I think if the major consumer base had not turned, then we might have stayed more in a place of Afrocentrism, more positive messages. But that's not the only change. There were multiple changes. There was also a change in the business community in terms of in the 80s, it was mostly small labels, maybe 10 to 15 people worked there, maybe 20 people would work there. You could see, you could touch the president of the label, be it Russell Simmons at a small label, then small label, Def Jam, Monica Lynch at a small label, Tommy Boy. So these were creative people who had a direct relationship with the artists and could work with them and carefully choose them and choose positive people. You get into the 90s, you start to get into multinational corporations, gigantic labels with, you know, multiple connections to other things, where they were much more comfortable in, well, you wouldn't really know the president of the label. They would not be creative people, you know, people coming from other industries, you know, the television industry, what have you, to run a record label. So you lost that sort of sense of quality control that you once had. And sort of the other thing that happened too was that it was very easy for rappers to be critical of Reagan and Bush. I mean, just for those names to come out of a rapper's mouth were sort of an instant sort of punchline, and the audience would immediately know, like, yeah, fuck Reagan. Clinton really made that really difficult, right? I mean, he was considered the first black president, right? He was cool, he was on Arsenio, he seemed down with the community, he was as hard on the war on drugs as anybody before him had been. But how could you be critical of this much more complicated emotional relationship to be critical of Bill Clinton? After 8 years of that, I think as a community, we had sort of lost the impulse to be critical of these political figures. I assumed that the rise of Bush would return it, but it didn't. I assumed that Katrina, and the aftermath of Katrina, would return us to that stance, but it didn't. And now we have a president who completely confounds rappers' ability to be critical of government. There's a few rappers like Talib Kweli and Lupe Fiasco who are critical of the system, but they're not really critical of Obama. They're just like, I don't vote for anybody. I'm completely out of the system. Which sort of seems very complicated and like, it certainly doesn't make the audience say, oh, doesn't make anybody excited about like, you're critical of the first black president, like should we give him a break? I think that going forward in history, we will continue to see this sort of difficulty with challenging the leadership, because the leadership will remain difficult, will pose a challenge for the rappers to be critical of, because they will continue to be people, or the next president will continue to be a person who it is difficult to challenge because of who that person is. You know who I'm talking about? Who will be the next president of the United States? Hillary. And I really believe that. I think she is a person with extraordinary amount of power, extraordinary amount of, this would be one of the most extraordinary, if not the most extraordinary resume to ever run for president. And you think about somebody who could perhaps win voters from the other side of the aisle. Perhaps Hillary could do that, even though that's not really how we do things anymore. We used to have a system where, here's your Democrats, here's your Republicans, who could win the people in the middle. But I think following the 2000 election, we're really not talking about that anymore. We're really not talking about, there's really few to no persuadables or undecideds. We're really talking about you be the farthest left Democrat that you could stomach, and you be the farthest right Republican that you could stomach, and who could turn out the most people in Ohio and Florida and perhaps Virginia and Colorado and those 6 to 8 states that are toss-up states. So we aren't really we're not really choosing the president. We don't really get a vote here. In New York, we certainly don't see, we don't have any power to actually choose the president. We don't see any ads. They barely come to visit us. But if you live in one of those 6 to 8 swing states, then you'll see it a lot. But there's certainly no need for Hillary to try to win over Republicans or even independents, because there's so few of them that that's not what the race is about. It's not what the game is about. And part of what has happened over the last 20 years is that the number of Republicans has slipped while the number of Democrats has remained the same. And a lot of those people who used to call themselves Republicans now call themselves independent, and they're not actually functional independents, right? The next time you go to a party or what have you, and somebody says, I'm an independent, ask them who was the last president they voted for, and ask them who do they vote for before that, and they will almost always say they will consistently voted Republican or consistently voted Democrat. Because there's almost no functional independents who actually are going back and forth each election. So it's ultimately this sort of turnout game of who's going to turn out more on each side, and the Democrats have an advantage in that, which is why they've won 5 out of the last 6 popular votes. I think only once of those 6 times, they got more than 50%, just barely more than 50%, but that was only in 2004, not in 2000. So, it's a difficult road forward, I think, for the GOP. But I don't, hold out much hope for them. Let's get some of your questions and what you guys want to talk about in this conversation. We have a disclaimer before.
So I would like to invite the executive board members to come around and collect your guys' questions. As stated before, the views and the opinions of the speaker do not represent the viewpoints of the Black Student Alliance.
But you agree with that personally, right? Personally. But not the right. But you're the president. And you agree with me. So, right.
All right, what I do?
Okay.
So, you guys can the first question I wanted to ask to kind of get us started. Can you comment on how oppression is expressed through other means aside of music? For example, like comedy. Is this expression positively or negatively affecting the expression of the Black identity within America?
Other ways that oppression is reflected. I mean, I think you see it in all sorts of ways. You want to talk about where it exists within comedy? That's what you're asking me? I mean, you know, for the most part, I find comedy's discussion of race very regressive and not very complex and not very interesting, and especially the rare times when I get stopped on Comic View because I turn to BT and then I drop the remote as I'm trying to pick it up. On Comic View for a minute. And it's this very regressive, Black people do this, white people do that, ha ha ha. Drives me nuts. There are a couple people who are doing more aggressive, interesting things. I mean, you know, Dave Chappelle is somebody who's dealing with race in really interesting ways, in really challenging ways. I think a lot of us in this room miss Chappelle, wish he would come back. You see things happen in the world and you're like, that's such a Chappelle sketch right there. I think in a lot of ways, in some ways, Django Unchained is a Dave Chappelle sketch writ large. And actually, I visited this class at Harvard that is about Tarantino films. And the day I was there, they showed this Chappelle sketch. Remember the time haters, right, who go back in time to hate? And so they had these pimped out guys, Chappelle, Charlie Murphy, and was a short one, Danelle Rollins. You know, they're all Jerry curled out, pimped up, and they're talking to a slave master. And, you know, the slave master's like, you know, I'm going to whip you. And they're like, no, you're not. You're not a gun. And then the slave says, from behind says, well, since y'all are from the future, when are we going to get free? And Dave says, how about now? And then they shoot the slave master. And Dave finds this hysterical. And he presents this as like, nobody else finds this funny except me and Neil. But that's kind of, I was like, that's kind of Django Unchained writ small. Of like, you know, the slave sort of says, I choose to get my freedom now in a way that's totally ahistorical, did not happen, you know, it's not representative of all of any actual historical reality except sort of emotional reality that we wish would happen, and sort of this modern vision of something that happened in the past, sort of this hope that we have that one slave would rise up and conquer and destroy. Did most people see Django Unchained? I mean, did anybody? Actually, the more interesting question perhaps is there anybody who, raise your hand, who is refusing to see Django Unchained? Wow, two in the back. Well, yeah. Why, sir? You refuse to see Django Unchained? Why?
My reason for not seeing it because it truly is not a true representation of what the American dream truly exhibits. It doesn't truly exhibit what the 13th Amendment, which freed slaves, truly did. That's my view, why I'm not seeing it.
It's not a true representation of what actually happened. I mean, that's true. It's not a documentary. It's not presented as a documentary. But I still think it's sort of, it is an extraordinary film. There is a catharsis in seeing a slave destroy slavery, at least the slavery in his corner of the world. And it's this love story on at least 3 levels. There's this obvious sort of love story with him and his wife, and he is determined to save his wife. And we were arguing about this. One of the brothers, wasn't you. Well, you know, not this part of it. And he's another one who refused to see Django. That he is so focused, he shits on the other sinners, right? He allows one to get beat, right? That's we were talking about that. That he allows. Oh, okay, right. The president, right? And he allows another slave who's half dead, sort of, to get completely killed because he's there to save his wife, right? And at the point at which, now I'm getting into spoiling. I haven't seen it. I don't want to spoil it for those of y'all who haven't seen it. But he is completely focused on saving his life, right? There's another sort of love between Schultz and Django where they love each other as brothers and learn from each other. But perhaps the most important sort of love in the film is the self-love that Django shows, right? From the first moment that he is freed, he throws off the cape, right? And he loves himself, right? And he carries himself with this dignity, right? With this posture. There's this consistent sight joke in the film where he rides into town on a horse, and people are like, whoa, what the fuck is that? You know? And it's not just we've never seen a nigger on the horse, as they actually keep saying, but he looks like no black person they've encountered because he loves himself, because he has destroyed the colonized mind inside of himself. And at one critical point in the movie, DiCaprio says, why don't they kill us, right? Because there's more of them around than us. And he goes into this sort of phrenology thing of like, well, their brains are different than ours. He's close. It's not in the brain. Our brains are the same. It's in the mind, right? It's in the colonized mind, which thinks that white people are superior, which would accept slavery, even though there's 100 of us and 3 of them, let's just get them. But they wouldn't do that, right? And Django has defeated the colonized mind inside of him, which is the most sort of exciting form of love that we see in the movie, and part of why he is not a historically accurate character. It's absolutely right. This is not the Nat Turner story, right? We got that. We know that. We didn't set out to make that. We set out to make a film. He set out to make a film that tells the story of this particular non-historical figure who destroys slavery in his world. And I found that rather extraordinary to watch the 4 times that I watched it.
The next question is, I read and loved. I read and loved Never Drank the Kool-Aid last year. Who has been your favorite interviewee and most challenging interviewee, and why?
Who wrote that question? I'd like to know. Who talked to you? What's your name? Beth. My most challenging interviewee, I mean, there's so many reasons why that would be. I mean, like, you know, I interviewed J-Lo, and it's like really hard to keep in mind what the next question is going to be. Because I'm like looking at her, and then she smiles, and I'm like, I completely forgot what I was you know, Beyonce kind of had that same sort of thing happen too. I mean, you know, Courtney Love was like really pissed off about something else the day that she came to talk to me, and you know, it was totally like riding this wild steer of like, I'm about to leave, screw you, like, fuck that question, no, I'm not on drugs, and everybody in the controller was like, she totally seems like she's on drugs right now. You know, and I'm like, feeling like I'm dying. This is such like this combat mode of like, I don't want to be here, and I'm going to leave in 5 more minutes, and I'm like, how am I going to get her to stay in the chair? And then I started talking to her about sex, right? And the question was, because she's kissed all these guys in rock and roll, like, who is the best kisser in rock and roll? Which obviously actually means something else, but we're going to start here and work up to that. And without even working up to that, she just jumped right to, like, well, actually, I'm better than all of them, right? What are you talking about? Like, well, you know, she's like, you know, girls who aren't pretty have to work harder for it, right? So we show up and we bring the party, rather than the pretty girls who, you know, want you to bring the party to them. Which is actually a really sort of interesting comment. And that sort of like broke the ice and opened her up, and after that, she was more chilled out. I mean, in terms of the other side, you know, it's just been a lot of incredible people. Jay-Z is always a great interview. I've talked to him many times. Really, really smart guy. Guy who's willing to answer any question. 50 Cent also answer any question. You know, I mean, I appreciate guys who are like, they're not afraid of anything. You know, you go anywhere, you can challenge them, and they don't feel defensive or what have you. You know, I had a couple of interesting interviews with T.I. I remember talking to him, like he did the bid, and then I talked to him and I'm like, can you promise us that you're not going to go back, that you've changed your life? And he's like, yes, I made significant changes in my life, and it will never happen again. And then 3 months later, he got arrested for the same shit. Man, come on. I mean, you know, Questlove is brilliant. You know, Tupac was a great interview. It was sort of amazing just being around him and like listening to him. You know, I remember having a couple of great conversations with Biggie. So I mean, I've just been blessed to have, you know, conversations with a lot of people who shaped hip hop. I just personally have had less experience in rock and roll, but some of those people.
The next question is, what are your thoughts on a post-racial society versus a post-racist society? How would you propose we move past either race or racism embedded in our social structure?
Who's that from? What's your name?
Caitlin.
Caitlin, thank you for the question. I don't think that we're in a post-racial society, right? That suggests that race no longer exists or no longer affects our world, right? That's not the case. I mean, race is still deeply important in deciding who gets ahead and who doesn't, right? And that doesn't mean that no black person can get ahead and every white person does. But the likelihood of you getting ahead is far greater than the next person, right? The benefits to you accrue, and you obviously give away some advantages of being female, right? So the boy next to you, nice as he is, he has some advantages that you don't have, right? We're not in a post-racial society, we're not in a post-racist society. We are in a white supremacist society where the advantages that we talked about before, the advantages of white privilege accrue repeatedly throughout your life. So you are probably not a racist person, I assume, since you're here. To me, you're not a racist person. But that doesn't mean that you're going to reject the benefits of white privilege, or that you even could reject the benefits of white privilege, because they come to you in subtle and obvious ways all the time. I mean, even like sort of gross example, but just just something that seems obvious to people. You remember The Help? See that movie, The Help, right? It was horrible. I went to see it so I could brick it, right? Like, you go see Django so you could brick it. And I'd be like, Spike Lee, I hated that shit, but you didn't see it. White privilege affects her at every turn, especially, like, just notice, like, right at the beginning. She goes to apply for a job as a writer. She has no experience. She gets the job, despite no experience and not even knowing how to apply for a job. She gives a letter of rejection as a letter of recommendation. And she gets the job writing about how to, like, home economics, right? So she immediately has to go to the black person and ask her, how do I do this job? She doesn't deserve the job, but white privilege got her the job. If the black woman who actually knew how to clean your house, spick and span, went for the job, she would never get it. So it's just sort of like, a gross example of white privilege at play. you know, how do we move past the race or racism embedded in our social structures? There's no easy answer for that, and I don't know how we do that because it's so enmeshed in the fabric of society, right? And the advantages of white privilege are so like invisible at this point, you know. It's going to be difficult. It's not about sort of just blindly not paying attention to race anymore, because the advantages have already been baked in from decades and decades, if not centuries, of the different power dynamics in this country. You know, I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I don't see anybody sort of proposing any easy solutions, or I would have already read about them and could quote you what book you need to read. You know, but it's you know, it's a huge issue that we are going to be dealing with for a long time. Du Bois talked about, you know, the color line being the issue of the 20th century. Well, he was half right. It's also this century too. You know, Barack Obama's election is indicative of something, but it's not indicative of everything, right? Because, you know, Sean Bell and Amadou Diallo and Oscar Grant and Trayvon Martin and many, many, many others would say, well, it's not everything. So it's the best that I can do.
All right, next question. What do you think about Rob Parker's comments on Robert McCurry's blackness?
Yes. Oh, yes. How are you? Good. We had a good talk about Django. I was really disgusted by what Rob Parker said. Is everybody aware of what we're talking about? Rob Parker was a commentator on an ESPN show called First Take, where they would talk about their opinions about sports. And one day he said, RG3, the superstar rookie quarterback for the Washington Redskins, he said, you know, I'm hearing weird things about this brother, that he's not down for the cause, and he has a white fiance, and he might be a Republican, and he might be this, and he might be that. All of it, except for the white fiance, was always total circumstantial evidence. Right? There was nothing concrete in what he was saying. He's not down for the cause. And I wonder if he's a real brother. It's like, really? You're still talking about this in 2013? His perspective was disgusting. There's no place on ESPN for that. It's a place where they're supposed to talk about the games, the players, not their lives away from the field like that. Totally uninformed comment. I would like to ask him, if I could, what does down for the cause actually mean? Because I think in the 60s or the 50s, there was a much clearer cause that could be identified and quantified. Now, what I need in terms of racial struggle is not what you need, is not what she needs. Like, we don't need, there's not one sort of cause that we're all down for. You know, I reject this notion that not marrying within the community is supposed to be an insult to the community. You know, I don't like the notion, I don't like the Republican philosophy, but I don't say that a black person who is a Republican is not black. They fully have the right to choose that. I disagree with their ideas, but I don't say you have left the community because you are choosing to be a Republican. So, you know, I found what he had to say. Look, my whole book was about you can choose whatever way you want to be black, because there's not a narrow dogmatic vision of how to be black. There's not one way of being black. There's an infinite number of ways of being black. Each one of us can use blackness to be whoever we want to be in terms of our identity choices. The only thing that links all of us as black people is that we have and will experience racism in our lives. That's it. Everything else, there's no commonality that links every single black person in America. So this idea that there's a cause, or there's one way to be black, and if you are Republican, you're not really black, or you're married to a white woman, you're not really black. It's just really ridiculous. One of the interesting things about the whole Rob Parker moment was almost everybody came out and said, what an idiot. All the blogs, most of the comments on the blogs, most of the tweets I saw were just like, wow, what a moron. And he was suspended and then fired. So, and actually, everybody runs the tape of Rob saying what he said, but immediately after he said that, Stephen A. Smith came in and said, like, that was crazy. I'm not comfortable with what you said at all. So, I mean, his comments were rejected even within the scope of that show, within that moment. So, I mean, he was pretty well shot down. But I just saw either today or yesterday that he's now writing for a website that ESPN is invested in. So, in some way, he's snuck back into what they call the mothership. But, he's lost his television platform, which I don't root for anybody or hope for anybody to lose their job or lose their television platform because I disagree with them, but that's what happened.
All right, next question. What is your opinion on Dr. Cornel West's negative views about President Obama?
Thank you for that. What's your name? Veronica. I've known Cornel West a long time. He's an incredibly important thinker, and in a lot of ways, he's a beautiful man. And he takes this sort of Christian ethics to a place that is unusual in my experience, in terms of loving people and the sort of the love that you experience when you get around like really truly religious people. It just sort of emanates out. And it's like, wow, I feel so peaceful around you. I mean, he really gives that off. But this Obama crusade has been disgusting. It's been off-key. It's been sort of gross, and it's been very personal. I want you to be this way. Actually, I want to be your friend. I want to be hanging out in the White House with you, and I don't get to do that. So I'm mad at you. You don't support poverty. I don't get to hang out in the White House with you. It's not an effective way of going about a reasonable critique, and it has really damaged Cornell in that there's a lot of people who are younger than me who don't remember when, say, Race Matters came out, and everybody was reading it and blown away by it, and he would show up to places and we'd sit like groupies. Wow, it's so brilliant. You're synthesizing Curtis Mayfield and Plato and Nina Simone and like Socrates and and we could talk about soulful things and Nietzsche in these really complicated ways and still be black with it, and then and he has lost his sort of street cred, if you have street cred for academics. Because there's a lot of people, younger black people who are like, they sort of spit when they hear his name, and they, his name has sort of become sort of mud, which is unfortunate because he is a very valuable player in the intellectual life of America, not just black America, but America, and he has cost himself that in nominating himself to be, Obama's #1 hater, and not that there is not valuable critiques of Obama's policies, but the way he's going about it is not right. Sort of like, with my kids, I got 2 little kids, and, they come running in the morning all screaming about, like, I want breakfast. It's like, that's not the way to ask. You ask for it nicely.
Do you think the gay rights movement is the new civil rights movement?
Ooh, that's that. Thank you. I do think that the gay rights movement is a civil rights movement. And I know a lot of black people get very offended by that because they want to have this sort of monopoly on the concept of civil rights. And, they say things like, well, they can hide it, and we can hide it, if they weren't lynched, and we had it worse and they weren't slaves, and all that's true, but it's not the oppression Olympics. It's not a competition between who had it worse, you know? And I mean, you think about somebody like Matthew Shepard, some of them do get lynched, you know? But I mean, you know, gay Americans are legally prohibited from doing things that they want to do, from the pursuit of happiness and liberty and life. And there's no other group that I can think of that has actual laws prohibiting them from doing things that they want to do. And when I look at the battle around marriage equality, we're really talking about a sort of romantic segregation, right? And saying that when John and Jim want to get married in most states, they can't, right? And that says that their relationship is lesser. So that means their love is lesser, and ultimately their humanity is lesser, right? Forgetting all the other things, the practical things, that they can't visit each other in a hospital, and they can't share, you know, their life in sort of, you know, some official ways. And the government says, well, you know, we don't recognize your marriage, so when your partner dies, you owe estate tax. But, you know, when your partner dies, because you're a heterosexual couple, then you get to share your, like, it's ridiculous, right? And the Supreme Court is taking up the Defense of Marriage Act this summer, and I'm almost certain that it will knock it down, because several other courts have already said it's unconstitutional. Seems nearly impossible that the Supreme Court will find it constitutional. But, you know, I've seen in my life the way that marriage changes the way that people around you see you, right? Especially for a man. Like, wow, like, you committed. Like, you're in a family. Like, you're down for, like, one woman. Like, we like you. You know, we're glad that you're out there. And to say to gay Americans, you can't get married, you can't form a family, is this very sort of deep rejection of them as human beings. And, you know, I'm not comfortable with that. And I don't think we as Americans should be comfortable with this de jure segregation at the level. It's very important for us to move forward where they can get married too. Ask me to read this. In your opinion, why is there a negative feeling from African Americans toward Republicans when the Republicans are the one partly responsible for freeing the slaves?
That was mine.
Who wrote that?
I was just wondering exactly what event made it all flip-flop.
You wrote that?
Yeah, I was just, because I know when the amendment was passed, they were towards Republicans, but like what event in history exactly made it change? Ben?
What's your name?
Ben?
Ben.
Yeah.
Thank you for the question. It's a good question. Black people were, as we already discussed, black people were Republicans most black people were up until the 60s. So I think that the impact of slavery led black people into the Republican Party. I think with the New Deal, the Democrats started to peel away black people, right? And then when you had this significant break in the 60s, right, the party's totally changed. I mean, the party that freed the slaves is not the Republican Party we have now, right? It's entirely different. And the party that emerged after 1964, when they started dealing with the Southern strategy, you know, Nixon declares the war on drugs. Reagan makes it even worse, and we're dealing with the constant demonization of black people over and over. That is a big reason why black people are pushed away from the Republican Party, feeling the Republican Party hostile toward them. I mean, starting from the rejection of the Civil Rights Act is a large part of the conversation. if the Republican Party was the same as Lincoln's party that freed the slaves, then we'd still be with them, but it's not. It's entirely different. So, we're talking about two entirely different parties.
All right. Do you feel like the war on guns will be like the war on drugs? More black and Latinos in prison?
Well, there's not a war. He said, is the war on guns going to be like the war on drugs, more blacks and Latinos in prison? There is not a war on guns. There's not a war on guns. Who asked that question? Good question. Thank you. There is not a war on guns at all. There's gun rights is completely dominating the gun control team. I mean, it's like, the Globetrotters and the Nationals. It's not even close. They spend more money. They have all the laws the way they want them. I do not. There's no war on guns. There is a group of people who are hoping to see gun responsibility, gun safety emerge in this country. And there is a larger group of people who are not for that. And this is an interesting issue that's not just Democrat versus Republican, because there's a lot of Democrats who, almost all Republicans are pro-gun rights, and many Democrats are pro-gun rights. It's very sort of regionalized in that people from urban communities see very much the value and need for gun control, and people from more rural areas see a need in their lives for gun rights. And I see their side of it, but I also see that there are many sort of common sense things that we can do to make America safer. The universal background check piece doesn't demonize or take guns away from responsible gun owners, right? Reducing magazine size, why anybody needs a 20 or 30 or 40 clip magazine is beyond me. And certainly that's not what you need. When the intruder is coming in. I mean, the entire intruder myth that the NRA spreads is completely false. The gun is 20 to 40, depending on what statistic you listen to. The gun in your home is 20 to 40 times more likely to be used on you or a family member or a friend, than on that mythical intruder that the NRA tells you is about to come through the door any day now. They set up the false choice. But what are you going to do when the intruder comes in? If somebody comes into your home to do you harm, and you don't want them to come in, then you should shoot them. But what are you going to do with that gun the other 364 days a year? And how do you know that you're keeping it away from your little Adam Lanza? How do you know that you're not going to end up shooting your friend or family member? Because that's far, far more likely. And I don't want to take guns away from people who want to take that risk and have a gun in their home. They deserve that right. But there are things that we can do to make guns safer for all of us. I want to take your question.
No, I'm just wondering, who is anyone to say how many rounds is appropriate for anyone to have? And who's to say that that intruder won't come? Who's to say that people only can have 7 rounds? If a woman is being gang raped by 10 men, 7 rounds isn't going to do it.
When's the last time that happened?
I'm just saying, it hasn't, I don't know that it has happened, but I'm just saying, who says it won't happen? You don't know what the future's going to hold. I was just in Virginia not too long ago, and, thank God I can have, I can conceal carry there. But I was in Virginia just 2 weeks ago in a Hilton Hotel garage where some man was trying to approach me, and my gun stopped him. I didn't have to shoot him, thank God, but it did stop him.
How many bullets does your gun hold?
It depends on which gun I'm carrying at the time. The smallest round that I have is probably is 8. The largest is 17. But who's to say that I can't have that?
What we're getting into.
I'm sorry, just real quick. The Second Amendment does say that I have the right to own a gun. If I've been trained properly and I am responsible with my gun, excuse me, if I'm responsible, anyone in here has that right, and no one has the right to tell me that I have to be limited.
Well, you know, the Supreme
I don't care how big your name is, it doesn't matter.
The Supreme Court's decision on Heller is clear that you don't have the right to have anything you want anywhere, anytime. So just as there are limits on the First Amendment, there's possible to have limits on the Second Amendment. But you can't have a drone, you can't have a tank, you can't have an RPG.
It's not a gun.
It's not a gun.
For my personal use, if I want to have more than 7 rounds, like in New York, I can't even carry my gun in New York if I want to, and you know that because
I know, and I'm not worried about getting shot in New York.
But I'm just saying, what I'm saying is,
Isn't
I'm
that
originally
amazing? I live in New York City. I'm not worried about getting shot.
But I'm originally from New York, okay, and I know people who have been shot in New York, okay. You may not be worried because you probably have people who are surrounding you.
Nobody's surrounding me. I'm by myself.
Okay, you say that, but I don't know that, okay. But here's the thing, you know, who's to say that I can only have 5 rounds, 7 rounds in my gun? If I want to have 15, you know, I was pulled over not too long ago with 15 rounds, and I didn't have a problem.
Right, because it's legal. That's why you didn't have a
And
problem.
it needs to remain legal.
But,
our rights should not be infringed on.
But, you know, you don't, I mean, you just say, I should have it because I want.
It doesn't, whatever the purpose is, and it's not for hunting.
That's what you're saying.
No, I can say we protect our family with it, our household.
But we're giving people who are criminal and who are insane, who want to walk into a theater with a gigantic round, the ability to kill many people quickly.
And they have gun-free zones and in places where people say they don't. It's mostly in gun-free zones.
Not mostly in gun-free zones.
All you have to do is do the research. There's a lot of gun violence that's going on, and these mass shootings are being done in gun-free zones.
Yes.
That putting a sticker and saying this is a gun-free zone is protecting anybody.
Then why
but the proliferation of guns, and we're getting over there, the proliferation of guns is not helping us. And putting more guns into the theater, into the school, means more killing.
No, it doesn't.
It absolutely doesn't.
We have 100 million guns in this country.
No, we have 300 million
well,
guns.
300 million guns.
300 million guns.
But
and we're still not safe. How many more guns do we need to have? But you know what?
Drunk drivers kill more people than guns do.
Drunk drivers kill more guns. That is not true.
Well,
that is not true. That is not true. And over the last 50 years, it's not true. And over the last...
I'll punch you. Somebody pull up the stat. Somebody pull up the stat. If you have a phone, pull up the stat. Pull it up. Pull it up quickly.
The very last question, we're going to know cars probably. Look around the room. We may be preaching to the choir. How do we bring this message to people who need to hear it in a way that is honest?
Who has that? Thank you. Yeah, I mean, you know, most of the people who came here sympathetic to the message, absolutely. You know, you guys are an awesome crowd, most of you.
Drunk drivers commit gun violence every year.
You know, I don't know. I don't know the answer to that because, you know, people who are getting the wrong message about society and see it as this zero-sum game, that the more rights we extend, the more liberty we extend to you and to me, the more that they lose, so that they are afraid of extending rights and liberty. You know, the people who are getting that message, I don't know how to turn them around. If I knew how to turn them around, I'd be doing that. You know, I don't think that we can just sort of vote them out, you know, of power, but we're kind of working toward that. You know, when we re-elect the president, right after he says that he's for gay marriage, we are telling people, telling the politicians, it's okay to support gay marriage. I don't think we're headed for a federal marriage equality statute or law, but we are we are moving forward on that. We are moving forward on rights for women. But some of the structural things that hold back black and brown people, hard to unravel, as we were saying before. So I mean, it's, you know, I'm not sure. I don't have easy solutions. I don't know anybody who does have easy solutions on how to reach people who are not ready to listen to the message. But, you know, hopefully more and more people like us, you know, will go out into society and change things, you know. But I mean, I think it's a multi-generational process. Anything more? No? That's it? Well, you guys have been awesome. Thank you so much.
It's like 5,000. Yeah, it's right here. I got it right here.
We should. We'll show it to him.
Can I show it to him?
Not now, but.
I feel like he would.
Buying a book or getting your book signed, we would like you to gather in the front lobby when it comes out. Thank you very much.
It's in the Department of Transportation. It's right here.
Yeah.
It's in the Department of Transportation. It's right here.